Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Intelligence operations are woven into every era of American history, and the secrecy of those operations has always been in tension with our national value of transparency. Here to discuss how those tensions are playing out today is the author of a new book, The Spy and the State, and a senior research fellow at the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida, Jeff Rogg. Jeff, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Terry, for having me. Great to be here.
All right, you've got a new book out, just released, The Spy and the State. Before we dig into that specifically, what I know about the intelligence community, I get from movies and books. What do you think the average American knows or thinks about those two components, the spy and the state?
Probably about the same for movies and books. There still is an image that intelligence is fast-paced and Jason Bourne-ish or James Bond-ish. And really, there's a lot of slow, deliberate moving pieces in it. A lot of the intelligence, the real purpose is for analysis and to provide decision makers, people like the President of the United States, with the best information available to make decisions. And one big thing that I think we still continue to get wrong is intelligence is not about prediction. It's not about predicting the future. It's about providing your best analytic judgment, collecting information that you think policymakers need to know. And then, of course, there is that covert action piece that everyone loves, where you try and shape the world around you without people knowing exactly what you're doing.
So you make a big point of the term civil intelligence operations or civil intelligence relationships. What do you mean when you use that term related to the American people in the state?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because we talk about civil military relations all the time. And when we see tensions, for instance, between generals and elected officials, or between what the military is doing and what civilian policymakers perhaps want or expect, and we haven't really had a similar idea for intelligence, and yet we see civil intelligence relation problems all the time. And, one of the great contemporary examples is the role of intelligence in politics and the perceived role of intelligence officers, or perhaps, a deep state, as it's sometimes accused of being, in American domestic politics.
So how are we doing collectively in getting that balance correct?
Not good.
Else, why would you write a book?
Exactly, right? It helps to write books about things we don't do so well. If everything's going great, it's hard to write a book. But, really, I try and point out that this is a recurrent issue in American history, particularly the problems of when intelligence gets involved in politics. And we never really strike the right balance. And that's really what it's about is, how do you balance the role of intelligence, which involves doing things secretly in a state that values transparency and where people expect transparency in the government. So that's one of the key tensions in civil intelligence relations in the country, is how do we balance the role of a secret intelligence instrument in a democratic republic?
Well, your book is really a history book, and you start your investigation back in the Revolutionary War, talking about the role that intelligence plays. What were some of your most surprising historical findings as you did your research?
Oh, that's such a great question. Because a lot of it's just fun to discover. I think that was the bigger piece, is that things were happening kind of like today that the average American didn't really know about. And I loved the Revolutionary War period. I just like it as the military historian, but I also like it as an intelligence historian, because so many people that this country reveres, our founding fathers, were actually involved in intelligence operations. And at the time, people really wouldn't have liked that. The American people really wouldn't have liked knowing that people that they thought were these honest, forthright, plain honest men, as was written in the Constitution, were involved in something that they considered to be un-American. And so I'd say finding at each period of history, things that perhaps the average American didn't know what was going on, but the government was doing, that's always fun. And I think that's why people are inherently curious about intelligence today. It's kind of like we talked about. Everyone wants to know what's going behind the scenes of national security.
Well, you even talk about the Lewis and Clark expedition as an intelligence expedition, which I thought was really interesting. Tell me more about that.
Sure. Well, it's published at the time as this expedition to check out North America. What are the best routes across the continent? But at the time, the difficulty was we still had to contend with old world states and empires, Britain, Spain, and France, who could have threatened what was a very young and small United States. And so part of the point of the Lewis and Clark expedition was a strategic reconnaissance of North America. It was at a point in time where American policymakers were thinking about expansion and the risk of war with states that still could have threatened our existence.
So you divide your history recollections into four main time frames. What are those and why those divisions?
That's a really good question. And I did that because it's easier to read history when you can sort of pick out periods, And so the first period that I talk about is where the president of the United States really did a lot to personally control intelligence. And that was something that started with George Washington when he was president. He requested funding from Congress that would allow him to pay for spies and intelligence activities as he saw fit without really talking about it. But then, so from the earliest days of the United States and George Washington through about the Civil War, intelligence was more or less something that we call a hub and spoke model. The president's in the middle, and that's the hub, and then there's spokes leading to individual intelligence agents that were hired and sort of used on a temporary basis. By the Civil War, this is too big for the president to control. And so I talk about departmental control of intelligence, where all of a sudden it's the State Department, the War Department, the Navy Department. And the problem with that is now intelligence is being controlled more by departments than the president, and they don't always work well together, and still don't, by the way. And so it's harder to coordinate intelligence. And from about the Civil War through the Second World War, that's one of the key tensions, is these departments create their own intelligence organizations. Even more intelligence organizations are created. So this is the birth of the U.S. intelligence community, as we call it today. And it was hard to coordinate them. And so the departmental control model fails really by the Second World War. And now everyone's talking about how do we coordinate it? And that's why in 1947, we create the CIA. And so there sort of was this coordination model that we're still kind of grasping at today from the creation of the CIA through the end of the Cold War. But at the end of that, I sort of pivot away from that control issue and talk more about what I'm calling the American intelligence state. Is intelligence now occupies such a big space in national security, and it's going to occupy an even bigger one in the future because intelligence is more important, not just in the United States, but around the world. And so I kind of conclude with looking forward rather than backward about what does this mean for the United States as a republic and for our Constitution.
I'm speaking with Jeff Rogg. He's a senior research fellow at the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida and the author of a new book, The Spy and the State. All right, so we're talking about those different periods in history and looking forward. You also cite some recurring problems in our civil intelligence relationship across that history. What are they and where do they stand today?
So we've sort of already discussed two of them. One is, and this is a very contemporary one, the issue of the relationship between intelligence and politics. And I mean domestic partisan politics. Every time it happens in American history, it doesn't help the intelligence community, it doesn't help the stakeholders in government, and it doesn't really help the country. So it's just a recurring issue, and we just always have a problem with it. Another one that we just spoke about is how to coordinate intelligence in the United States and coordinate the work of the U.S. intelligence community, this sprawling community of multiple organizations under different executive departments who sometimes don't talk to each other that well. And we saw that a few times, most recently with 9/11. And, beyond that, and I've alluded to more of these issues, there's a big problem. Americans really don't like to find out that their own country was spying on them. And so domestic intelligence scandals, which sometimes also occur along with political scandals, are periodic throughout our history. And they're one of the ones that I just spoke about in terms of an American intelligence state, is how much or how difficult it's going to be in the future to control what intelligence does at home versus what it does overseas.
So we all walk around with intelligence gathering devices in our pockets, in our hands. As long as we're connected to the internet, Google knows more about me than probably my father does. What lessons do you want your readers to take away from your book regarding the management of the intelligence state today?
Fantastic question. And this is, why historians write history is what are the lessons learned for today? And you're exactly right. Intelligence is all around us. It's unavoidable. And it's not just the government that does it anymore. We willingly give out volumes of private information to corporations through our electronics, through our purchasing habits, through social media. And so, I'm fundamentally concerned with what that means in the future. What does it mean for how the Constitution operates? What does it mean for personal privacy? For liberty versus security is really the big one that I always talk about. That's what is at stake with all of this, is how much liberty do we trade in exchange for how much security? Because it is a trade-off. And what worries me today is we're approaching a place where in order to be more secure, you need to be less free. But we're not even that secure anymore because other countries have these capabilities as well. And so this is the promise of American intelligence, that it will, even in exchange for a little bit of our liberty, it'll keep us more secure. I'm not sure that we will be either more secure or more free in the future. And intelligence is one of the big reasons why.
I think that's a really profound question. How much we're willing to trade of one for the other. Trade security for more liberty, trade more liberty for security, or as you also ask in the book, trade someone else's liberty for our security. Where do you hope we wind up in that conversation?
So what I mean by that is, it's all well and good. It's very easy to trade someone else's security for your liberty. And we've done that throughout American history. One of the things you asked me about what I like to find is I found so many instances in which Americans are reporting on their fellow Americans. Needlessly, and innocent Americans reporting on their neighbors just because they were the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time. We are willing to do that continuously throughout our history. Again, trade someone else's security for our liberty. And I guess what my purpose is we'll never fully strike the right balance. But I just hope that we strike a better balance than we have, in the future than we have in the past. And I think one of the ways we go about doing that is by understanding intelligence better. As you mentioned, too much of it is informed by TV or by movies or by really fictionalized versions of what intelligence is. I do think that a more realistic understanding of the big controversies in American intelligence history, the things that continue to bother us to this day that always have in the past, and what we can do as citizens in a democracy to change that is really the path forward.
Well, Jeff, I want to thank you for the effort that you took to write this book. I think it's a contemporary service, especially as we think about our politics and the conversations that we're having right now around security and liberty. And thank you for joining me to have this short conversation about it today.
Thank you, Terry. This has been wonderful.
I've been speaking with Jeff Rogg, Senior Research Fellow at the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida and author of the new book, The Spy and the State. We'll post this interview to federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.